And so if you were to stay off the specifics that I got into, the racial divide, and this is actually something me and Crambo touched on earlier, with the idea that this is going to stem to an extent from your view of what is a natural right and your positive rights that are or that are given to you by the government versus your negative rights that are simply reinforced by the government.
Oh yeah, that's more of a like a personal viewpoint. Each right wing person you talk to is going to be slightly different.
So something that's always, and you're right there, because the Christian right is definitely going to have a different perspective on that from the more classical liberal right, or the neo-lib right.
Yeah.
Another thing that's always confused me then slightly about the idea of the alt-right, and this is premising with the idea that the fundamental goal is to raise right consciousness. It's not to be a political party or political agent as it is in existence now.
Yeah.
The goal, the telos, is to raise white consciousness. There, oh, fuck, I'm too drunk. I lost my point. What the hell were we just? What was the last point you just made?
So you said something about racial consciousness. Now the alt right's not a political party.
Oh, and this is the point that me and Crambo go on about it. Get curious about is within a racial group, and if we go race and then we go even more specific to ethnic,
Mm-hmm.
there are so many different political and value ideologies and value axioms within those groups that they're more likely to split along those lines, and those are more effective lines through which you can bind people, because white people can be split based on something as simple as having a different language even though they share the same race, but the focus of this ethno idea seems to be based around whiteness, and it's kind of a, is that not a flimsy thing to base your premise on when you even have so much ideological difference within it? And we're watching this ideological difference rip the white communities apart, where liberals who are white and Republicans who are white don't associate with each other.
Well, there's a couple of things you can talk about in there. So, I'm not a white nationalist. I'm an ethnic nationalist. I think there's absolutely value between uniting the different ethnic groups underneath a racial banner, but not like a European Union type of authoritarian state. No, no, no. Each ethnic group, I think, should be able to rule themselves, because there are differences in language, culture, religion, things like that. But there needs to be some kind of underlying consciousness that says, hey, between the English and the Germans and the French, for example, a classic example, they're all very similar. They come from similar origins. Their societies are similar. There's only things like language and religion and, like, I don't know, food that separates them. So there's no reason for them to endlessly slaughter each other in the pursuit of some pointless war. So that's what the white consciousness is. It's a reaction to the history of Europe and how consistently we fight with each other rather than fight outside groups that threaten us. So in response to World War II, where you have essentially the same groups killing each other, we want to avoid that. So you could say it's an emotional reaction, and it varies from person to person. But the overarching theme is that we're all a part of a shared history. We're all a part of a very similar group. We should respect each other's boundaries, but still realize that, hey, we're a part of a similar sort of thing here. We got the same kind of thing going on.
So I don't disagree with you about that whole back end of it. It's not only a fundamental reaction, or however you described it. It's natural. It's written into your genetics to have that in-group, out-group response, right? And as I pointed out, whether you can along ethnic line, and I appreciate you making the difference between ethnic and racial white nationalist. And you can draw the lines along those different categories of where you're going to consider your in-group and your out-group, and at which point you're going to sacrifice with, and at which point you're going to bargain. Which point you're going to bargain with, and at which point you're not going to give in on in any way whatsoever. For example, when you operate on a family level, you operate in a socialist atmosphere. There's all families, or I guess every properly healthy family that we've seen operates on a socialist atmosphere. Now, I'm not saying we need to go full-blown socialism all the way up the scale as large as we can, but we do recognize that having the different states of Europe sitting in the same room delegating and making rules and making the legislation and policy together has resulted in an overall larger state of peace than when they were all legislating within their own little biomes and then extending outwards and just clashing with each other instead of
Right.
working together, right?
This is why someone like Richard Spencer wants to take the concept of the EU and simply turn it into a right wing institution, because fundamentally it's a left wing institution. It's a left wing authoritarian in the sense that it's trying to coerce a bunch of different states to work together. Because so Germany is so dominant in the EU, they make a lot of policy decisions. They have all the money, things like that. They're trying to dominate other European groups, but in the EU that we envision is more of a cooperative with no legal power. It's simply a place to not only air grievances, but to what's the word? Like strategize. It's like a company
It
meeting.
it actually legislates.
What?
The EU isn't just a place to discuss grievances and compromise like the UN General Assembly. It
That's the issue.
it full blown fucking legislates.
Yeah, that does. So when the EU tells the UK that these fishing waters that belong to the UK can't be used by the UK, that's a serious overstepping of the boundaries between states and will only lead to more fraternity violence, as like some people like to call it. So we don't want that. We want to destroy that. We want something like the UN that's particular to European states, where they can come together and talk with each other without legislating over each other.
Okay, so I don't disagree with that. But that's why I'm curious is we do have to extend that. So for example, and I'm going to play a hypothetical here, but
We need the
the
whole
U,
Roman Empire to happen again.
the U.S. breaks off, and for some reason, the Asian Americans take over California, and the African Americans take over their one little area, and all the Americans take over their area. And I know that's very basic.
Yep.
When as they're living in their situation, they're going to go through their state of chaos, and there will be upswings and downswings. But at points, they will start legislating together and realize, hey, I've got a boundary here along the fucking Mississippi, and the white folk are just on the other side, and they're polluting the river, and we're not polluting the river. And at some point, we're going to have to sit down and make this legislation together and come to some kind of determination because of reasons and factors beyond that of race, because of environmental factors, social factors, economic, etc. They're going to be forced to that point. So we're constantly finding ways in which we've expand that circle of legislating together and expand that perimeter in which we legislate and work together, because the more we draw it down, the more likely we're inevitably going to result in war.
Sure. Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Well, that's good. I've never heard somebody at least come to that term on me.
Well,
That's my only concern with the all right, man.
well, you have to understand the base foundations of some of our principles is that okay, so the state is essentially it kind of varies between right libertarians. The only reason that right libertarians are on the right wing is because they believe in a natural hierarchy. They also believe in tradition in a lot of ways, and they're sort of against cultural Marxism, and a lot of right libertarians are traditionalists as well and religious, so they're generally considered right wing. But the difference is that most right wingers see the state as a tool. It's some kind of tool that man can use to further their interests, and that the power of a collective is more powerful than an individual. So we want to cooperate in a state environment. So now that we've established, okay, the state's good, we can use it as a tool. Now we have to focus on how we can best use the state to function. And one of the key aspects of the human condition is conflict with one another. So the reason why humans develop social norms and high trust societies is because it's more productive to not rape and kill each other. So essentially what we want to do is reduce the amount of raping and pillaging amongst each other for whatever reason, whether it's racial or ideological or religious or whatever. We want to separate these groups into their own little areas to try and avoid conflict as much as possible. This is where the whole ethno-state thing comes from. Because if you look historically at all of the civic nationalist societies, they always end up clashing among racial lines or ethnic lines, you could say, is a little bit better of a term, no matter what. And so as a reaction to that, and a sort of understanding history, it's like, okay, we need to resegregate ourselves among ethnic lines and then then it's kind of like you have a border wall, and then you have two people who are shaking hands over the border wall. Like, it's a mutual respect between one another. And the point is that we want to reduce this conflict as much as possible.
I'm glad that you draw that distinction between ethnic lines versus racial lines because that's a huge fucking thing. And when you're talking to the alt right, you have different ideas there, where some people are speaking ethnically and some people are speaking racially, and it's
Most
a
people
huge
use
difference.
the racial point, the racial worldview as a starting point, because most people don't understand the differences between a Frenchman and a German and a Swiss. We
That's
understand
just not.
because that's our people. So there are some people who, like Richard Spencer, who views this grand white society like America happening, where we're all kind of intermixed. I just don't think that's realistic, but that's more of a some nuance within the movement in and of itself.
No, well, it makes a huge difference because that's the whole premise on which my a lot of concerns the reason why the alt right in general to me is just unappealing and looked at it's like it's that ideology is not going to stand for obvious reasons that we've seen throughout the past is that I've seen two white communities right next to each other who are split more down the line between a white and a black community just based on the fact that they have different languages rather than the fact that they have different identities. So ethnic is very important there.
Well, now comes the issue that the alt right is bringing up, is that there is no racial consciousness amongst whites. There's no sort of brotherly interaction between these states, and there really hasn't been ever in the history of Europe. So this is sort of a new idea. This pan Europeanism
Okay.
is relatively new, and we want to try and uh, get this to happen because we're tired of killing each other. You know.
So this idea though is actually uniquely Western and even more so uniquely American. Within even the Black community, for example, when you talk about the international Black community, there is stereotypes amongst certain Black communities internationally towards how lazy or how unproductive other members of the
Oh,
Black
trust me, I
community
know.
from other
I
international stereotypes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not necessarily then driven once again. That's the whole point that I'm making is that like I know the alt right is trying to pin white as their first
Well,
attack, right? Or there's the first premise. Let's shoot broad and narrow it down later,
sure.
right?
But it's not a
There's
uniquely American concept. You might think it is, but it's actually not. If you read the writings of these European intellectuals or the intelligentsia back in the day, they had these ideas already. The only issue was that they couldn't propagate them as well as we could today because of technological limits. So even back during World War II, this is probably the most recent example. There was a sense of fraternity amongst the different ethnicities in Europe, but it was only amongst the most well-read of the society, the political leaders and things like that. Amongst the masses, there was still pretty much a cultural or ethnic divide. So we want to kind of reignite that and spread it to the masses, and it's very easy to do that nowadays because of technology.
yeah, I don't understand my mic. No, I don't disagree with that. Um, it's just like I said, and I guess I'm kind of speaking for Crambo at this point. But the idea is that this whole conversation started on to is that even within that, you get into that white ethnic group or whatever you extend it down into. And this is, I was thinking about this earlier, but it almost feels like I'm just getting hypothetical at this point. But it's kind of like that idea that a lot of societies have always drawn in cycle, kind of a cycle of we have an in group and then we learn that governing into a larger in group and working together and expanding that in group as much as we can has resulted in more productive and more stability and more peace. And that is constantly, I will not deny, touching on the last point you just made, it's entirely predicted on technology. The only reason why we're expanding our in group to the level that it is now is because globalization is such a factor and we can fly around the planet in less than 18 hours. Like
That
that
too.
kind of shit, it's a whole different game, right? And you could make a good argument that that is accelerating at such a pace that our biology can legitimately not keep up with it. Um,
Yeah.
but
Well,
we're
now
dealing.
you run into the issue that the alt right also brings up, is that we we don't inherently want to have these values. This is not something that we just came up with and said, "Oh, that sounds good." It's more of something that was forced on us, because there are groups in this world who don't think like Westerners do. There are groups who are highly in-group preferenced, and who will very likely exclude or kill those who are not within their in-group. And so it would be nice. I would prefer it if the world could work in a multicultural sense, where we expand our in group to people of different genetic clusters. But it's just not realistic. And in particular, my experience living as someone in like in a white minority community, the same respect that we extend to other genetic groups is not extended to us. And it's not going to be until a certain level of intellect is the average amongst these groups. So it's not saying
And
that we want to divide ourselves amongst racial lines forever, but we want to do this until the point where other societies aren't threatening to come in and destroy us from within, which is what's happening now and will continue to happen until we resegregate ourselves.
and what concerns me is that the answer to that seems to be violation of certain elements of those fundamental pillars of belief in which our Western white ideology is built upon. That individualism, that freedom, that wonderful form of governance that we, as the alt-right believes, is genetically influenced, which we don't have the actual connection to the genes, but we're going to assume through social studies that that's what we can come to. That is genetically influenced. We have established that, but at the same time, there are certain elements of that that we are going to sacrifice towards authoritarianism for the sake of preserving that. Is there a recognition
Oh,
of the
sure.
contradiction there within the alt-right?
No, I don't think it's a contradiction at all because I used to be a libertarian, but then when I started actually reading about, well, because I always kind of knew about race realism, living as a white minority, but when I really
Biological essentialism.
sort of, if you want to call it that, sure.
No, no, it's biological essentialism. It was kind of rebranded to be more edgy for the internet, but it's biological essentialism. It's 50 to 80%. There's no dispute about that. Yes, the bell curve is real. I don't know why liberals dropped the fucking ball on that one,
Yeah,
but
exactly. So, but the thing was, I never had the science to back that up. I was always like kind of, thinky face
it's
emoji.
the science is only 30 years old at tops.
Yeah, yeah, it's somewhere between 30 and 70 years old in some
Sorry,
areas.
I meant minimum. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
In the 70s and the 80s, and a lot of the IQ data. I think IQ originally got started being recorded after World War One by the United States government or something like that.
yeah. So the issue I was as a libertarian for a long time, I came to these conclusions. Well, hey, it would appear through all of the data that I have that libertarian ideas were born in Europe and have only been maintained by European peoples. And there's
You
only
don't know
ever,
that.
well, I do know that. If you look at the
No, we
voting,
don't. We
well,
only know that from historical record, though. We don't know that at the beginning of history. What point you're talking about to where libertarian ideas come from?
the point is that they've only reached us to today because of white European societies, and they're only maintained by white European societies.
Are
Is
you
the
talking about
thing. The idea of individual rights, universality is a
Yeah, you're
European
talking about the
concept.
Enlightenment period. Enlightenment period.
Exactly.
Liberal ideas. Yeah, not
Yeah.
libertarian.
Well, it's sort of the same thing. I was talking about me. So as a libertarian, my ideas of what the individual are and how the state operates came from
Oh,
a
okay.
place of the Reformation and the Enlightenment
Yes, yes,
period.
sorry.
And
I
so
follow you again. My bad.
so then I started looking at voting patterns and race and IQ and things like this. And then when you start to talk to people in real life, as I do, about libertarian ideas or sort of these Enlightenment liberal democracy ideas, it would only appear that the most intelligent people of these groups are capable of even swishing those ideas around in their head. And then you start to look all around the world, wherever you try and apply this, and there's a large group of people who aren't very intelligent, they always tear it down, destroy it, and replace it with autocracy of some kind. And it's not even good autocracy. It's horrible, like African warlord tier autocracy. So
I don't disagree.
so that leads me to right libertarianism a couple of years ago, where I was like, okay, we need to preserve this sort of racial construct because it would appear that in reality, in the here and now, not in the future, but in the here and now, these ideas only exist within this racial group for the most part, or like the very highest amongst the other groups, which is statistical anomalies as far as I'm concerned. So we want to preserve that. So we almost have to self segregate from these other groups.
Okay, so I get that and I understand that, and like I said, that's why we point out the. Oh, jeez, that my house invaded. Hold on. I'm gonna have to end this conversation right after this. We're gonna have to pick this up, maybe. I really want
Sure.
to with Siva. But so that's the idea, is like there's a sacrifice, and a recognition that we need to. There's a contradiction in the idea that to preserve the fundamental right of the individual, this wonderful, beautiful thing that was dreamt up by Western liberal society as the alt-right views it, to preserve that, there's an
Ah,
element of that we're towing a line of where we're going to sacrifice and what we're going to sacrifice and how far we're going to go and when is it worth doing that. And that is my
see,
conversation. That to me, that thin line, that's where the real conversation with the alt right is for me.
see. Now you get into the issue of the individual person's perspective on individual rights, because when you transform from like a social democrat and you move towards the right wing, if you start if you start to read right wing literature, you start to understand why the concept of social democracy starts to fall apart. So
Okay.
as I started to read, I started to understand more of how my concept of the state was incorrect and my concept of history was incorrect in a lot of ways. So as I became more well read, it sort of opened my eyes a little bit to how the right wing thinks, and that's
And
where my
and I had
perspective
a
comes from.
and I
So
had a conversation with Shrugart on this Discord as well about the definitions of liberalism and how liberalism is reaching the end of its terms and its failure.
right,
I do need to cut us off. Dip. I got a bunch of background noise going on right now. But me and you can run this as a trailer for a conversation that me and you are going to have about that thin line that we just narrowed down to. Because every time I have an alt right conversation, this is where I get, and I want to push past it.
yeah, this goes into
So,
theoretical right wing philosophy. So this is not something
and
many people talk about.
color me uneducated, so I can have a
Sure,
conversation
as
about
long
it.
as you're open to the idea, I don't care if you believe it or not. Just don't
Oh,
attack me.
dude. Oh, dude, have you not listened to me
No, I
very
have. I'm
much?
just saying.
Oh, yeah, no, man, that's not what I'm about.